It looks so good right now.
Thank you.
Do you ever just take a bite out of it raw?
No, but I would love to see you do that.
Not today. Welcome to the Food 52 Test Kitchen. My name is Josh. I'm here with Sarah Owens, James Beard award-winning author of Sourdough. We're gonna make some bread today. In a previous episode, we were talking about sourdough starter, but today we're really gonna focus in on bread. How to proof it, how to bake it. Any questions that the Food 52 community has about sourdough bread, we're gonna answer it today. And then we're gonna taste some bread.
Today we're gonna make a basic sort of, I call it a table loaf. It's a recipe that's it's very versatile for different applications. You can make a sandwich with it, you can make toast with it, you can make croutons with it. So I went ahead and prepared for us some leaven, so it's nice and ripe and ready for us to go. I know it's ripe and ready because I can see fermentation bubbles sort of breaking the surface. I can smell it and it smells ripe. I can see fermentation bubbles sort of from the side, so I know this is ready to go. Cool. So we've already got our Dutch oven preheating because we're gonna bake a loaf of our pre-prepared dough a little bit later. But what we're gonna do now is add our leaven to the bowl. So Josh, do you wanna start?
Yes.
So go ahead and add 60 grams of your ripe and ready leaven. Okay, I'm gonna do the same. And now it's time for us to add our water. 300 grams of water. So go ahead and...
Does it matter the temperature of the water?
I encourage people to use room temperature water to be consistent. In the summer, if you find your fermentation is going really fast, then you may want to use a little bit colder water. But in general, room temperature around 75 degrees is great.
Sure.
We are using stone ground organic flour, which is going to be a little more thirsty than a conventional flour that's been roller milled, like a flour you would buy at the store.
Right.
So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're using that type of flour, you might want to hold back a little bit on the water. Okay, now that we've got our leaven and water in the bowl, we're going to go ahead and either use our hand or a spoon to just kind of stir it and break up the leaven. So I think it's really nice if you can get into the habit of using your hands, because right now I'm really surprised at how warm this water feels to me. So in doing this part, I know that the fermentation already is off to a flying start. Okay. Once we get our leaven sort of dispersed throughout the water, we're going to go ahead and add our flours. We're going to use 310 grams of bread flour, and we're going to use 80 grams of the whole wheat. This is a pretty basic loaf. It's not super high in whole grain, but you could also alter how much whole grain you use as well. If you do that, you just need to keep in mind that the more whole grain you add, the thirstier the flour is going to be. So you're going to want to add a little more liquid if you're adding more whole grain. Once you get used to making this recipe over and over again, you will be able to see the differences once you start tweaking.
Sure.
And you can adjust accordingly.
Sure. Learn the basics first and then
Exactly.
see how you play around.
Yeah. When we're ready to mix our dough, basically our goal is to get the flour fully hydrated.
Okay.
And we're gonna do that again using our hands. So just plunge your hand right into the center of the bowl and squeeze and kind of turn your fingers and your wrist and your arm. What we're doing right now is really just kind of working this kind of slurry into a nice sticky mass. You want to make sure you get all of that dry flour off the bottom of the bowl into the top of the mix. So this is like a 3 to 4 minute mix. You're really just feeling for any dry lumps. You want to make sure and get those fully hydrated. And the dough is going to be pretty sticky at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the definition of sticky right here.
Yeah. So a lot of people, if they're used to using like conventional yeast to make bread, the dough is usually a lot more stiff and kneadable.
Okay.
We never really knead this dough. So already I can feel like this dough is really starting to kind of come together. This is what I call this shaggy mass stage.
Okay.
So this is before we've added our salt.
Right.
But the idea of holding back on the salt is to allow the flour to fully hydrate.
Right. Because salt draws the moisture out of things, right?
Yeah, salt has a lot of different effects on the behavior of dough.
Sure.
So one thing is it makes, salt makes things taste salty, but it also has this osmotic effect of pulling water away from the flour.
Right.
And what we want right now is for the flour to start that conversion process from starches to sugar.
Right.
And the only way we can do that is by allowing it to become hydrated. So allowing the water to penetrate into the flour.
I hold back on salt sometimes when I'm cooking vegetables. If I want a vegetable to sear, I'll wait to add salt until the last moment, because if you add salt too soon, then it draws the moisture out of a vegetable and it can steam.
I learned something today. Thank you.
Sure. So once you squeeze the dough through your fingers and it feels good, it rests for 20 minutes.
Yeah, go ahead and cover it so it doesn't dry out. Let it rest and relax and the flour fully hydrate, and then you're ready to add your salt.
Okay.
This is also a really good time to feel how the dough is performing.
So this is the moment where if the dough felt dry, you would add a little bit of water.
Yeah, or it may not feel dry, it may just feel kind of stiff and like resistant to you actually squeezing it and mixing it.
Okay.
Also, adding a little bit of water at this point with the salt also kind of helps the salt dissolve into the dough. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind.
Sure.
So we're gonna go ahead and add 8 grams of salt. And when we add it, we just wanna kind of sprinkle it over the surface of our dough. If we want to, we can add a little bit of water. I like to just kind of do this little number.
Sure.
And then it's the same process as when you were combining the flour with the water.
Sure.
You're just kind of squeezing and working the salt into the dough. One thing you don't want to use is any kind of salt that's been iodized or has other sort of things added to it, because that can affect the fermentation.
Now I can already feel a difference in the dough. It's not sticking to the bottom of the bowl in the same way at all. So that's the water is like absorbing, the flour is absorbing the water.
Exactly.
So it's not so sticky.
And also the gluten is starting to form.
Interesting.
So gluten is made up of 2 proteins, gliadin and glutenin, and when water combines with flour, those 2 proteins start coming together and forming bonds. And the more you work the dough, the stronger those bonds become. The whole goal of this part of the bread making process is to leaven the dough, leaven the bread. And in order to capture the gases of fermentation that do the leavening, we need to create a stretchy network. And that stretchy network is gluten. Okay, so this feels good to me. I can feel that the salt, I don't feel any more granules of salt in my dough. So I feel like it's ready to enter into bulk fermentation. Bulk fermentation is going to take about 3 to 4 hours.
Okay.
Maybe like 3 to 3.5 during the summer, maybe 4 to 4.5 during the winter.
Sure.
And we'll talk about the cues of when it's ready to shape.
Yeah, the cues of fermentation.
Cues of fermentation,
I love
exactly. We're going to cover it, and if you're like me and you forget that you need to come back to it, you could set an alarm.
Sure.
Every 30 to 45 minutes, you are going to do something called a stretch and fold.
Okay.
Okay?
I got a bowl, you got a bowl. Mine looks different than yours.
Right. So it's been about 30 minutes with your bowl after we've added the salt.
Sure.
And now it's ready to do the stretch and fold. Again, this is just a process that we do in lieu of kneading to further strengthen the gluten network in the dough.
And this stretch and fold, you keep doing it every 30, 45 minutes until you're ready to bake the bread.
Until you're ready to shape the bread.
Great.
This dough has already gone through a stretch and fold,
Right.
so what we're going to see...
Much smoother, right?
Yeah, there's more definition and has a little more cohesive appearance. We're going to see your dough, as you perform this step, go from this to more of this. Okay, so I'm just gonna demonstrate really quickly how to do a stretch and fold. I like to wet my hand first to keep the dough from sticking to my hand. I'm gonna kind of reach underneath the dough and release it from the bowl and gently just turn it toward the center. I'm gonna rotate my bowl and I'm gonna perform that same step all the way around the dough mass until I get it all to the center.
Sure.
And that's it. So once you've done your stretch and folds, then you just want to cover it back up to keep it from drying out.
Right. And then just do that again every 45 minutes.
30 to 45 minutes. But the idea is to really get it from that shaggy mass to more of a strong, cohesive looking ball of dough.
Great.
Yeah.
And so then how will you know when it's ready to shape?
Okay.
Because that's the next phase, I guess.
Exactly.
Right?
This is actually pretty close to being ready. It has been fermenting in bulk fermentation for about 4 hours now.
Okay.
Now, what I'm looking for, what I would like to see, I just stretched and folded it, so I'm not going to see it as much, but I would like to see some bubbles sort of breaking the perimeter of the dough ball. Maybe I might see it on the surface. I can also kind of use my wet hand to kind of poke and see if I see that little bubble. So I can see that gases are being trapped within the dough, and I know that that's a cue that, okay, it's ready to be shaped.
Now we have these.
We have these.
This is a bread basket?
Yeah, it goes by different names. Most people call them a proofing basket.
All right.
These come with a liner, which I like because I like to do fancy scoring. You can also use them without the liner, and that picks up, once you flour the interior, it picks up the pattern of the basket. So some people prefer that. What we're gonna do is throw down a little bit of flour onto our surface. Don't be afraid to use flour. Now the trick to getting this dough out of the bowl without deflating it is to use your bowl scraper. I also like to make sure my hands are nice and floured. You're gonna tip the bowl, and as you tip, you're gonna encourage the dough to release from the bowl as you go. Okay, that way you're never like pulling or tugging on the dough. Now this is enough dough for about 2 loaves. So we're going to shape these loaves using a 2-step process, a pre-shape and then a final shape.
All right.
So to pre-shape, we're gonna kind of pull our dough from the top to the middle, the bottom to the middle, and then the 2 sides. And once I get those, I'm gonna pull in the corners to the middle as well. So I have a rough round shape. I'm gonna use my bench knife to pick it up and plop it over. And then I can also kind of use my hands to tuck. But at this point, I'm not really fiddling or fooling around with my dough very much.
Right.
I just wanna kind of suggest to it what shape I want it to be. So our dough has been resting. It's kind of visibly relaxed, and we're ready to move into final shaping. The goal of this part of the process is to gain a little more tension as we work and to get it into the basket seam side up.
Seam side up.
Yep.
All right.
So let's talk about the basket for just a second.
Yeah.
The point of the basket is to provide support for the dough as it's resting in the refrigerator overnight.
Okay.
So if the bowl is too large for the size of dough that you're using, then it's gonna kind of spread out and sort of flatten. You wanna just be kind of aware of what size your basket is with what type of dough you're using. For our final shaping, again, we're just gonna throw down a little bit of flour. We're gonna use our trusty bench knife to pick up our dough and flip it over. If there's a lot of flour on the underside, we wanna just brush that off.
Sure.
That's gonna keep our dough from sticking to itself. So sometimes I'll just like tuck in the top just a little bit to get me started. And then I'm basically gonna stitch the sides of the dough toward the middle in an overlapping fashion. Okay,
All right.
sort of looks like a mummy. When I get to the bottom, what I'm gonna do is roll and tuck. And as I go, I'm gonna kind of try to tuck in some tension to the loaf.
So
okay?
you're sort of stretching it as you
Yeah, so I'm just tucking, rolling and tucking, rolling and tucking until I get all the way over, okay? You can see I have some nice fermentation bubbles.
Yeah.
And then I'm gonna flour the top of my loaf really well, push my bench knife into the seam. So right now the seam is going this way. So I'm gonna push it in, and that just kind of helps to seal the seam a little bit. Flip it over into my hand, and then cradle it into the basket. And that's it. This is just sort of a typical way of preparing a loaf to go into the refrigerator.
Great.
We're gonna cover this up. I like to cover it with a cloth and then like a plastic bag. The cloth is gonna keep the condensation that gathers on the plastic from dropping back onto the dough while it's in the refrigerator. This formula, this recipe, can hang out in the fridge. I recommend a minimum of 8 hours, but you can let it rest in the fridge for up to around 24 hours before you bake it.
Does the bread change depending on how long it's in the fridge for?
The longer the bread sits in the fridge, the more digestible it's gonna become. So that's one thing. Another thing is you get this increase of flavor from the acetic acids that are building up under the cooler temperatures. And you'll get a little bit of rise. Sometimes it's kind of imperceptible. It depends on how cold you keep your refrigerator.
We're back. There's a little bit of a weird noise now that we don't know why. Just roll with it. It's New York City.
We've got these 2 loaves. They've been in the fridge since yesterday morning, so quite a long time.
Yeah.
I pulled them from the fridge so that they could do their final proof before we prepare them for the oven. And I can tell that they're almost ready. They could probably sit out for a little bit longer. I want to kind of gently poke on them. I don't want to push so hard that I'm going to deflate the dough. But I just sort of want to gently poke. It should feel sort of like an inflated water balloon. So that's going to tell us, and I can also see like there's some bubbles breaking the surface. I'd like to see a little bit more of that before I turn it out onto the parchment and score it. But especially this one, I know you can see it's a little more swollen inside the basket.
Yeah.
I know it's gonna give me a beautiful loaf of bread. Now we're gonna bake it in a Dutch oven with the lid on for the first 20 minutes because we wanna capture that steam in the baking environment.
Moisture is a big component to
yes,
this, I think,
especially in the first stage of baking. We want, in order for the loaf to achieve its full potential of size, we want the outside of the loaf to stay nice and moist and supple until it's fully expanded.
Interesting. So that'll help it to expand.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah. If the crust sets too early, then it's going to hinder the loaf from expanding.
It's like locked in.
Exactly. Cool. And it's going to affect the crust, the crumb, and also the shape of the loaf.
Yeah.
So you would still have an edible loaf, it just wouldn't be as attractive. So these are just 2 examples of loaves of basically the same dough that I've scored in different ways. This dough is a little looser. You can see it's a little lower profile. This dough had a little more oomph to it. So it had a little more spring. But basically when we're scoring, we want to just imagine where this loaf is going to open up. If we didn't score it, then it would just open up wherever its weakest points were. I love this sort of crackle pattern that appears. I think that's a really rustic way of the dough saying this is what I do. There's different tools you can use to score with. You're going to want a razor blade that is pretty thin. So I use these double-sided razor blades. They come in packs. What we're going to do now is just turn this out onto our prepared parchment sheet. I like using parchment because it gives you a handle to transfer the loaf into the really hot Dutch oven. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it out seam side down. Just lightly flour the surface of the bread. I'm going to kind of gently massage that into the skin of the bread. And then I'm gonna dust off any excess. Nobody likes a mouthful of raw flour.
Right.
I'm gonna score it in a similar way to the loaf you just showed us.
Sure.
So I'm gonna go about 3/4 of the way across the loaf. Try to do this in a swift, even motion. I don't wanna saw at the bread. I don't wanna hesitate. Confidence is really key at this point. The loaf is starting to open up a little bit.
Yeah.
I wanna kind of work quickly to get it into the oven, but I may wanna add some decorative flourish.
Okay.
Just for fun.
Sure.
So I'm just gonna do some more like superficial cuts down the length of the bread, and this is gonna be kind of like,
Oh, like a wheat.
yeah. So as the loaf expands in the oven, these cuts are also gonna expand
Right.
as the steam releases, and hopefully we'll get a nice pretty loaf of
It
bread.
looks so good right now.
Thank you. So do we wanna put it into the oven?
Yeah, let's do it. This is extremely hot. This is like the surface of the sun.
So go ahead and take the lid off.
I'm gonna use your fancy gloves here.
All right, so we want to act kind of quickly so that we don't lose too much heat.
Sure.
We're just dropping it into the pan, putting the lid back on, and popping it.
Cool.
Okay, so we're gonna set a timer for about 20 minutes. Once the lid comes off, we emancipate the steam. The loaf has fully expanded, and we're allowing the crust to set. Depending on your home oven and also what type of Dutch oven you're baking in will depend on what you're gonna do next.
Okay.
So some people have an unenameled cast iron Dutch oven, and that black surface transfers the heat in a really intense way. So my suggestion, if that's what you have to work with, is after the crust sets, which takes about 5 to 7 minutes, go ahead and use a spatula or just tip the loaf out and remove the Dutch oven and continue baking on the middle rack.
Right.
And that's gonna keep the bottom of the loaf from becoming too dark before the top of the loaf and the crumb has set. If you're baking in a really nice enameled,
Food 52.
Dutch oven, lucky you. But you may not need to remove the loaf from the Dutch oven to continue baking. So if you don't have a Dutch oven and you're using, say, like a pizza stone on the middle rack, then what you need to do is introduce steam into your baking environment. And one way to do that is with a spray bottle.
Yeah.
Another way to do that is to preheat a roasting pan with your
like a pan
hearthstone.
Of water.
Yeah. So when you're preheating your hearthstone, you want to preheat your roasting pan. I suggest using a heavy gauge roasting pan, maybe not glass, even if it's Pyrex.
Yeah.
Because you're going to pour water into the roasting pan after you load the scored loaf onto the preheated baking stone.
Right.
And then once you close the door, you're gonna bake with steam for 15 to 20 minutes. And then after that time, if you still have water in your roasting pan, you're gonna take that out.
Right.
And essentially that's setting the crust, or that would be the same as taking the lid off.
Right. I love that this practice is so different depending on who you are or what you're working with. This is a bread that you made earlier, and it's nice and cool now.
It's completely cool.
When a bread comes fresh out of the oven and it's really, really hot, and
tempting.
like a new bread baker would think like, oh, I want to eat this right away.
Yes.
How long do they need to wait before they really?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
There's different answers. I suggest people allow it to cool as much as you can to allow the crumb to fully set.
Interesting.
If you cut into a hot loaf,
Yeah.
the steam hasn't completely escaped the crumb yet.
Yeah.
And what can happen is the crumb can get really gummy.
Yeah.
You want to let it cool completely so that you can maintain the integrity of the crumb.
All right.
If you want to just taste, the grain,
Right. The bread.
I
dust.
suggest doing just the.
I'll start with that.
Yeah.
I can feel it has like a little bit of like almost like a stickiness to it.
Tackiness.
Like a moisture.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of a hallmark of sourdough. It's what also just keeps it fresh for a long time.
Yeah. Cheers.
Bon appetit.
There's so much nice, like toasty flavor, and you get like the little salivation like in the back of your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
This is delicious, first of all.
Thank
so
you.
thank you. A lot of information. I get a sense that the real way to sort of internalize all the stuff that we learned today is to just do it a few times. And once you have that experience in your hands of having done it, a lot of the words that you said will start to make a lot more sense.
Yes.
Like it almost doesn't make sense to just try and absorb everything all at once. It's just the process of doing it.
You gotta practice. You
Yeah.
gotta smell it. You gotta feel it. You
Yeah.
gotta taste it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Use your hands.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks so much. This is great. We gotta end this video so we can eat more bread.
Exactly.
If you like videos like these, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.